All right, good morning. All right, good morning. All right, let's see if we can try to complete the discourse. Where'd everybody go? All right. Yeah, I'm rocking and rolling. I'm itching to go. Yeah. Follow the food. Morning. All right. My goal is going to be to finish the discourse between this week and next week, so we can start something fresh after the first of the year. So just to contextualize today's discussion, for those that have not been here before, and even for those that have been here before, it's always good to get context. So the focus of the discourse has been on the result of Adam and Eve's sin, result of Adam and Chava's sin, that they ended up being banished from the Garden of Eden, which, as we discussed at length, is both literally but also figuratively the spiritual consciousness of the Garden of Eden was no longer available to them. In other words, the world as we know it today, a world where divine consciousness is hidden, was the result of the sin. So, and as a result of that, the sparks that had fallen from the world of Tohu at the beginning of creation, those sparks that had fallen into the world, we refine those sparks, we redeem those sparks through recognizing the presence of the divine in everything that we do. Which basically means when we eat food and we recognize that God created the food and we say a blessing on the food, when we go to work and we understand that the purpose of work is to be able to elevate the environment there, to find the godliness in the environment there. When we experience challenge, we recognize that the purpose of challenge is for us to be able to find the godly intention within the challenge. When we receive abundant blessing, we recognize the presence of God in that blessing. In all of those instances, we're basically uncovering the godliness that's hidden within the world, the sparks of godliness that fell into the world at the beginning of creation, when the vessels could not contain the light that was put in them. So that's the purpose. And as we elaborated at length, the Alter Rebbe says that this is a very difficult battle. It's a difficult journey. because, I mean, just because that's life, right? Because life is challenging. And every experience, if we saw the godliness in it, automatically would be easier. But since we don't see the divine in it, so we have to struggle. We have to struggle to believe that God is present, and then to try to see how God is present and how can we respond to it, and so on and so forth. So the question is, what would have happened if Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, had not eaten of the tree? So how would all this work of redeeming these sparks, how would that have been accomplished? Right? It seems like that's the end game. The worthy sparks that fell even before Adam and Eve ate of the tree. So how would these sparks have been redeemed had Adam and Eve not eaten from the tree? That's the question. Make sense? Yes? Okay. So we actually started the answer, but we'll dig into it a little bit more. The Alter Rebbe says that had Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, not eaten of the tree, they still would have been able to accomplish this mission of uncovering the divine sparks. However, it would not be a struggle. They would have accomplished it in a different manner. It says in the verse that God placed Adam in the garden to work it. La'avda zeramach mitzvah. Say that's a reference to the 248 positive commandments. Lahamshech arin seif began eden. That the 248 positive commandments, they're positive commandments, they're positive energies. A positive energy brings forth a flow, as opposed to a negative commandment. The purpose of a negative commandment is to prevent interference, right? How do you take care of your heart? You take care of your heart by eating healthy foods and exercising. You prevent plaque in your heart by not eating foods that cause damage, by not smoking, by not doing things that are harmful to your heart. But how do you take care of your heart? It's through positive actions. So the negative commandments, their purpose is to ensure that there's no interference. But just because you don't have interference, it doesn't mean you have a relationship, right? You can not do anything wrong, but that doesn't mean that you have any connection. So in our relationship with God, you need to make sure that we don't do anything wrong, so we don't create interference. But the positive commandments is where the divine energy actually flows from. And so the 248 positive commandments, exactly what they mean in a pre-Torah world is a conversation for another time. But let's just accept it. Let's take it at face value that prior to the Torah, the Medrash says that our forefathers observed the Torah, Adam and Eve observed the Torah. So when God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden, he was placed there in order to work the garden, and our sages say to do the 248 commandments. So he would have done the positive energies, positive commandments in the Garden of Eden. We're on page 23. Vayidei ribli is galas ha'ar memeli salonitzutze kedusha shenaflu v'nisarvu bara v'yunechlalam b'sei cha'iris el yoinos sheyamshich ha'adam kiner b'fnei avuka. And through an abundance of light being revealed, so the sparks of holiness that fell down, that we mentioned before, that became mixed into the negativity within the world, those would be elevated and they would be brought up and consumed into the supernal lights like a candle before a torch. Like if the torch is small, then the candle that's close to it, that's nearby, becomes included and becomes drawn into it. But if you remove the light, you distance the light from the candle, from the torch, so then the candle stands apart. But if the torch is very big, then even if the candle is distant, it still becomes drawn into it. So the idea is, if you think about the light of the sun, it's so powerful, right? And you hold up a candle to the sun, During the daytime, it doesn't have much effect. So the further you go away from the sun, the more the candle is distinct from the sun. The more you get closer to the sun, the more the candle, so to speak, becomes drawn into the sun. The same thing is true, he's saying, in regards to a torch and a candle. You have a torch and you have a candle, the further the candle is away from the torch, the more the candle stands apart. But let's say you have a really, really big torch. So even if the candle stands apart, the really big torch draws the candle in. It doesn't mean the candle moves, but the light of the candle becomes subsumed into the light of the torch. And this is the idea that there are two ways to create transformation. We spoke about this at our last class as well. One way is to get into the weeds, get into the dirt, deal with the stuff, and change it like that, which is the reality of our world, our post Adam and Eve world. That's the reality, is we have to get into the weeds, we got to deal with the stuff. But even in this world, we have those moments, those opportunities where we shine such a powerful light, or we experience such a powerful light, that the darkness doesn't stand apart. The darkness becomes, the light that's in the darkness becomes drawn out of it and becomes consumed into the light. We see this at very happy occasions, right? When you're celebrating a happy occasion, you have much more tolerance for things that otherwise you might not have tolerance for, right? Things that might bother you at a different time. In the time of a great celebration, a great joy, you have less inhibitions around it. Or at happy occasions, for example, people will dance, right? And sometimes you dance a little nutty, right? If you see that same person on a Tuesday afternoon walking on the street and making those same kind of motions, you'd say, hey, something's wrong with this person, right? But is there, right? If you're walking down the street on a Tuesday afternoon and you feel this urge to dance, and you start dancing like a little bit of a nut job, is there anything wrong with that? Inherently, there isn't. Let it go, dance, be yourself. But the world doesn't have tolerance for that. But if you're in a place where it's expected that you drop your inhibitions, why? Because you're dancing at your wedding or your child's wedding or a friend's wedding, and you're just letting stuff go. Okay, then it makes sense. But the only difference is how close you are to the light. When it's Tuesday afternoon, you're far from the light. So therefore, it looks strange. It doesn't make sense. But when you're at the wedding, you're close to the light, so it makes sense. So this concept is, we find this in many aspects of our lives. When you wake up in the morning and you pray and you anchor yourself in God, and then you face challenge during the day, the challenge isn't so great. But if you are indulgent in yourself and you're self-absorbed, so every challenge becomes an overwhelming one. It's the same idea. When you're close to the light, the little things don't take up that much space. When you're farther from the light, they take up much more space, which is why we have a spiritual practice to constantly work on refining ourselves, constantly work on being plugged in so that we don't lose the anchoring of the divine consciousness. This makes sense? So what the Alter Rebbe is telling us is that had Adam and Eve not eaten of the tree, they would have been able to accomplish the same thing in a different manner. By just bringing down abundant light, it automatically would draw the sparks that had fallen into the physical material world. It would have drawn them forth, and they would have become consumed in the light that Adam and Eve would draw down through their positive efforts. Yeah.
What was the whole purpose of prohibiting them from eating of the tree?
Yeah, so as I've said a number of times throughout this discourse, my understanding, my belief is that the whole thing was a setup. And it's brought down in many discourses as such. King David says, Neira alilas habnei Adam, that God casts wondrous libels against the Son of Man. In other words, at the end of the day, it's a legit, your question's a full question with a full stop. What's the purpose of this whole thing? What was the purpose of the setup? Why didn't God just create it this way in the first place? Because that wasn't the intention, because there's something missing in this picture, right? What's missing in this picture is that the physical world never gets refined. The sparks are drawn forth from there, but the world itself doesn't experience transformation. So we're doing two things in this discourse. We're we're reading the story, so to speak, from a Kabbalistic standpoint on a literal level, but we also know that there's another storyline. There's another Kabbalistic storyline. But you have to answer the story, right? We know there are four levels to Torah, right? The literal pshat, the hinted, remez, drush, the homiletic, and so the secret. And they're intertwined. So within the Kabbalistic, you also have the literal. The literal of the Kabbalistic is what we're trying to ask here. What would have been, okay, it's a nice theory, but what would have been had they not eaten of the tree? The answer is there's a mechanism for it. Is it a full answer? No, because ultimately, how would the world have been transformed? How would the physical reality be transformed? And in particular, I spoke about this yesterday, that because it was yesterday's parsha was the encounter between Yaakov and Esav, Jacob and Esav, which the whole encounter is really this encounter between the spiritual and the material. And the whole reason why Rebecca wanted that Yaakov should get the blessings is because she knew that Esav didn't have the capacity. Esav, who represents materialism, Esav is the West, the physicality, materialism. Esav doesn't have the capacity to create that transformation. Only Yaakov does. But Yaakov is Yaakov. Yaakov is spirituality, is godliness. But when Yaakov works with Esav, when he gets into the weeds with Esav, then he creates transformation. Esav actually has a higher source than Yaakov. The physical actually has a higher source than the spiritual. So had Adam and Eve not eaten of the tree, that higher reality would never have been dealt with. We would have just extracted the sparks from it. I mean, it's like, it's going to sound weird, but imagine you could just eat the nutrients, extract the nutrients from the food, right? And just live on that. Never have the process of your body refining and separating out the nutrients, right? It's a pretty boring life. You never get to enjoy a steak, never get to enjoy a coffee. You just pop pills a whole day of nutrients. I don't know if you could even do that in theory, but even if you could, right? The whole purpose of the body is to be able to go through that process, to separate that out. The body that's what gives us life, is the body's natural heat comes from the fact that it's working, that it's processing food, that it's separating this out, right? All of life is about doing the work. So if all we did is live in a spiritual dimension and shine so much light that we pulled the light from the darkness, okay, mission accomplished. But that's not the purpose of creation. God created the heavens and the earth. Furthermore, but to your question, why would a God have created such a physical space? Right? Just put the sparks somewhere, and in other words, this didn't happen to God. God didn't make a mistake that there was this world of chaos that it shattered and the sparks fell down. It was part of God's plan. So if that was part of God's plan, he didn't need to have the sparks fall all the way into a physical world. He could have just kind of made a shelf and say, okay, that's where you go. Adam's going to come along. He's going to shine a lot of light, and he's going to suck those sparks into the bigger light. That's not what happened. He did let the sparks fall into a physical reality, which he had already created, right? So there's a game plan here. I mean, I see the game plan. I think we all do. Yeah, any other questions?
Need some help figuring this out.
Me too. Yeah.
Sparks that fell into the physical world, and the mission is to return them through performing positive mitzvahs. I don't know whether you said negatives do that work too.
In a sense, yeah.
So, if Adam and Eve had not eaten of the tree of knowledge, they would have stayed in the Garden of Eden, and these sparks would have been redeemed through other processes. But they would have been redeemed, but left behind would have been physical world that also needs redemption through.
Well, on a technical level, the physical world would have been left behind. That would have been the waste, the dross, just to stay there. That wasn't the intent. in that storyline, that wasn't the intention, right? The intention is the sparks.
But by eating the tree and going into the physical world, even that residue of physicality can be.
Yes, becomes elevated.
I think I see the two.
Yeah.
One being deficient. That leaves behind the physical unredeemed.
Yeah.
So you're saying the further away, the further away the candle is, the more negative they deal with and the more tension, but the closer, the less tension.
Yeah.
The more relaxed and more calm.
The easier it is for us to have the sparks, whatever it is. In other words, independent consciousness, self-absorption comes from the fact that we're distant from the light, the torch. And the more we're self-absorbed, the less godly we are in our experiences. Right? Rabbi Taub likes to say, more me, less him. Less me, more him. Right? The more I take up space, the less space there is for God. The less I take up space, the more space there is for God. Right? So if I'm less self-absorbed, how do I become less self-absorbed? By being more selfless, by being more divine conscious. Then by default, whatever is my consciousness is involved and caught up in godly stuff, in godly pursuits. Yeah. So here the Alter Rebbe gives some more examples of how a parallel for how these bright torches absorb the sparks. He says on page 24, similar to how it was during the times that the temple stood. There's a very interesting comment in the Talmud. It says that the Jewish people were only exiled. The whole purpose of the exile was in order to increase converts. Now, what does it mean to increase converts? If you notice, we're not missionaries. There's no we're not standing on the street corners trying to get people to convert to Judaism. It's not a Jewish thing. So what does it mean? What does the Talmud mean that the whole purpose of exile was to increase converts? So it says it means to elevate sparks, the sparks that have become distant, that have fallen into the world. When we elevate them, they're, so to speak, converted. We bring them back into the realm of holiness. So the same question, what would have happened if we know that the Jewish people went into exile? We say it in the prayers on the three major holidays. We say, because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. Wait, so were we exiled because we sinned? Or were we exiled in order to elevate these sparks, these converts? The answer is we were exiled because we sinned. And a byproduct is that we are able to accomplish this mission that needed to be accomplished, which was to elevate these sparks. Okay, but what would have happened had we not been exiled? What happens had we not sinned and we had not been exiled? Same question, what would have been had Adam and Eve not sinned and not been sent out of the Garden of Eden? The answer is it would have been the same way, just like in the Garden of Eden. We're saying that through abundant light, they would have sucked the sparks into the master light. The same thing would have been true had we not been exiled, that we would have been able to draw the light through other means, through abundant light. For example, like Nama, the Ammonite, who ultimately came to the Jewish people, converted to Jewish people. She was drawn to King Solomon, and eventually she converted. She became his wife and bore his son, right? So that whole story in the prophets, what happened? We know the story that during the times of King Solomon, the nations of the world were drawn to Solomon. His influence was so great that he didn't need to go diplomatically and connect with other leaders. Everybody came to him. All the nations, they sent representatives to Solomon, right? That's the way it should work. The light is so great that everybody just comes forth. And Naamah is an example because she converted. She converted. So here's somebody who was outside of the faith, but she was drawn to the light, to the extent that she converted to Judaism and bore his son. It's a very powerful transformation. And all the nations came to hear the wisdom of King Solomon, like it says regarding the queen of Sheva. What was the situation then? The torch, being Solomon in this case, was so bright, by way of analogy. So therefore, by default, all the sparks were drawn to it and became absorbed in it. And had the Jewish people not sinned, this would have continued. If the Jewish people had not sinned, so the temple would have continued to stand, and the people, all of those sparks that were out there, would have all been drawn forth as a result of that. They would all become refined. Like it says regarding the Messianic era, it says that then I will change over the language of the people. I will convert the language of the people to a pure language. Please. I will convert the language of the people of the nations to a pure language. And the verse continues, and all of them will call on the name of Hashem to serve him of one accord, right? Or the verse says, that the nations will go by your light. The idea being that in the Messianic era, we know this is the end game. The result in the Messianic era is that all the nations will come forth, right? I mean, it's a pretty powerful imagery. You have such a powerful light. Let's contextualize for a second. Light is a metaphor. It's just a metaphor, but it's the best metaphor we have. So we see, like, the police have these powerful spotlights. When the light shines on you, it blinds you, freezes you. You become stuck, right? By the way, we have other experiences that have a similar context. Sometimes you can hear. I grew up in California, so when an earthquake, anybody experience an earthquake? Yeah, when you experience an earthquake, I was there, and it was what was it, 87, 88, 89? There was one of the big earthquakes. Your first experience is paralysis. You become paralyzed. It's like so overwhelming. Like, what is going on? Something too big is going on. Then your instinct to survive kicks in, and you feel, where do I got to go to save myself? But the first moment is like, there's this roar, this shaking, and I go, whoa, what is going on? It's like, it's very overwhelming. And you can imagine, like, if you hear like a really loud noise, your first instinct is just to freeze. You become overwhelmed, something it's too big to contain. So I'm just giving you that a context. So light, the power of light when it's so bright, is it draws us to it. We see that with like really smart people, right? People who are extremely talented, even if we don't particularly have an appreciation for that talent, but we know, wow, that's amazing. They look at this artist, and you happen to be present, and they're painting something. You just get stuck there. You're overwhelmed by. So this is the idea that light draws to it. When Mashiach comes in the Messianic era, the revelation is going to be so great that anything that had any resistance to holiness is just the resistance is going to break, and the light is all going to be drawn forth. So that process could have been in the Garden of Eden, had Adam and Eve not sinned. And during the temple times, it was like that. Because they sinned, so they had to go into exile. Because Adam and Eve sinned, so we had to come into a physical consciousness. And now we got to get into the weeds. We got to do the work. We got to actually get our hands dirty. We got to engage. And like we said, yes, parenthetically, there's an upside that we actually fulfill the master mission, which is transformation of the physical reality. But again, on a technical level, now we have the downside is that we have to struggle. We have to battle. It's a struggle. It's not easy. And we're not always victorious. Oftentimes we're not. Oftentimes we lose the round in the battle. So in a sense, it would have been preferable for Adam and Eve not to sin, for the Jewish people not to sin, not to go into exile, and just to have the drawing forth of the light in a positive way. By the way, is an interesting story just talking about this idea that light is contained within the physical reality. So I heard this story from Rabbi Label Wolf, lives in Australia, teaches a lot of Kabbalah, and early on, when he became a rabbi, he was a rabbi at the Hillel at the University of Wisconsin, and I guess it would have been the end of the 60s, early 70s. It was a lot of spiritual awakening, and he said that my father-in-law was also a Chabad rabbi during the time at UC Berkeley, which was even crazier. And, you had just this immense spiritual awakening. Some of it was authentic and some of it was drug-induced. But you had this spiritual awakening. My father-in-law, Chaim Drizin, he describes that he felt like the Rebbe had put him there in Berkeley as an anchor, like a big ship anchor. And there was like this whirlpool or vortex going around of everybody, like, on their trains or whatever. And whoever was able to grab on, so to speak, got saved. I don't mean like saved like in a spiritual sense, but like they got anchored, because people were like going crazy. It was a nutty time. So Label Wolf says that he had, at the time, he had an audience with the Rebbe, and he told the Rebbe that people are coming nonstop and they all want to convert. Everybody wants to convert to Judaism. So he said, what do I do? Like, how do I discern who's authentic and who's just, on a spiritual high, and, in a week or two, they'll come off of it. So the Rebbe said, first thing you got to do is follow what Jewish law says. So Jewish law says, for all those that would like to know, here's the inside scoop, that when a Gentile who wants to convert, first you try to discourage them. And officially you try to discourage them 3 times. And if they persist, then you teach them some of the severe laws, right? If right now you could eat a cheeseburger. If you convert, then you eat a cheeseburger. It's a terrible sin, so on and so forth. Now you can marry whoever you want, then you won't be able to, all these laws. And if they are committed, if they still stay around, then you begin to teach them the beauty of Judaism. Once they show that they're serious, then you say the positive of it, and you encourage them, and you once they understand Jewish law and they understand how to practice and they've demonstrated their practice, then you complete the conversion with the specifics of the conversion process. Then the Rebbe said, and then you will know that they always had a Jewish soul. And the challenge of their Jewish soul was to be born into a non-Jewish body, to find its way to the light. Very powerful story. Over the years, I've had people come to me and say that they want to convert, and I ask them why do you want to convert? And almost without it, every single person says to me, I feel like I have a Jewish soul. I say, okay, wonderful. We don't know that. We'll find out, right? And more often than not, they don't have a Jewish soul, at least not with me, because they don't stay the course. They're going through a rough time, and they found God, and then they get wise and they say, you know what? I don't need that, and I can do, I can. Anyway, I'm just teasing, being a little cynical for no reason. But more often than not, people don't follow through. But the people that follow through have demonstrated that they do have a Jewish soul. That's the fact, right? The point is, I think the Rebbe's messaging is that the Jewish soul was always there. You don't bring in a new thing. It's the same Jewish soul. The body is what gets converted. But in that process, we come to uncover that which was there before. That's the messaging here. That's the power here. So can that spark be drawn forth on its own without needing to go out to the world? Yeah, we see that with Solomon. We see it in many ways with King Solomon. Maybe this is a little sacrilegious. I don't know, but there's no bearded chassids here to beat up on me. Huh? I'm safe. The Rebbe was a light that shined. Rebbe pretty much stayed in his corner. I mean, and before he became Rebbe, he was out in the world. He worked in the Navy shipyard. He went to Sorbonne. He put on tefillin with people in the Sorbonne. But once the Rebbe became Rebbe, he pretty much didn't travel. I mean, everybody knows exactly. I mean, it's a crazy thing. Like, can you know a man for 44 years of his life exactly where he was at any given time? It's all documented because he didn't go too far. He went to the synagogue, his office. He went home, synagogue, office. He went to the cemetery to pray, went back, went to the cemetery to pray. Other than that, he went to the doctor a couple of times. Most of the times the doctor came to him. He went to the Catskills to visit camp for a couple of hours. In the early years, in the early 50s, the Rebbe went to visit a number of people who were sitting Shiva a few times, but that's pretty much it. But look at the Rebbe's influence. People were drawn to the Rebbe. They came to the Rebbe. They brought their light to the Rebbe, and then in turn took that light and brought it to the world and brought more light to the Rebbe, so to speak. So we see this power of light. It's not everybody's mission, right? That's not that you have to be a Rebbe to be charged with that responsibility. The rest of us are charged to be in the world and to work in the world in creating that transformation. Okay. So the Kachal Ye'inyan on middle of 25, you can take a copy if you'd like to follow along. Kachal Ye'inyan Adam Kishaloi HaYachayte Shayakule Kaddish. So too is the story with Adam. Had he not transgressed, he would have been entirely holy. It says that the Torah says that Adam was formed from the earth. Where was that earth taken from? So the Medrash says that God took that earth from the place where the temple in Jerusalem was destined to stand. So the temple was a holy place. The earth of the altar was a holy place. That's what his very body was made out of, this holy earth. And from that place of the holy altar, Adam's limbs were made, anointed in oil, because the altar was anointed in oil. And where was he? He would have dwelled in the Garden of Eden, and from there he would have increased light. And therefore, all of the concealment, the klipa, which hides on the light, would have given up its resistance. It would have ceased, because the light that's in it would have been extracted from them, and it would have been drawn to holiness. But there wouldn't have been a struggle. There wouldn't have been a battle in that regard. Right? It would have just happened, the flow would have happened on its own. However, once Adam transgressed, now we have a battle. Now the struggle is there. Now to create the refining, to elevate the sparks, we got to struggle. It's not easy. And he quotes a passage from the Zohar that the time of prayer is a time of battle. What does that mean, that time of prayer is a time of battle? So first of all, the overall messaging is that if prayer is a process of refining, the Zohar is telling us that the process of refining is a struggle. So on a technical, on a literal level, that's the messaging of this passage from the Zohar, that prayer is a battle. But what does that really mean, that prayer is a battle? So first, let's talk about it as prayer itself is a battle, and then how this battle relates to this overall mission of elevating sparks. Before I go there, any questions on what we've just been saying? No. Okay. What happens in prayer? There was a person here last night. We had a cafe with music. This person was saying that this interesting thing is occurring to them, that as they get closer to God, they're finding it more difficult to pray. It's an interesting thing. The closer they get to God, the more difficult it is for them to pray. So, and this person was asking me for advice. So I said, look, what is prayer? Prayer is about talking to God. The problem is that the closer you're getting to God, the more you're trying to use the words of prayer to formulate your thoughts. So don't use the words of prayer. Just talk to God. In other words, the whole prayer, the prayer book was structured in order to give us tools to be able, if we lack the capacity to communicate on our own with God, so use the words of prayer. Here's a prayer book. Here's the tools. But if you can just go to your heart and talk to God, I'm not saying that there's no point in the prayer book. Say the Shema, say the Amidah, but talk to God. Just talk to God. That's what it's for anyway. Now, why do we have a problem talking to God? Why do we have a problem talking to God? Why do you have a problem? Do you have a problem? Do you have a problem talking to God? What happens when you try to talk to God? If anybody wants to get that vulnerable. You think about your sin. You think about how you're not worthy, right? What else?
Sometimes there's some impatience on my end.
In what way?
I guess waiting for an answer, the revelation maybe.
So you want results.
Yeah, results.
Okay,
sometimes.
good. What else?
I struggle with whether someone is listening. There's anyone there.
Good.
Mhm.
That's powerful. Yeah.
When you think upwards with love, then you have a blissful experience.
Okay, tell me more.
If you're open and it's not about, if it's not about impressing anybody, it's just between you and God and your love for God. But you're thinking like, well, when it happened for me, I was a lot younger, so I wasn't aware that it was spiritual thought. I just did it. So, but when you have that, then it's a blissful experience.
Good. So what I understand you're saying is that what interferes with the blissful experience is the preoccupation of, am I doing it right? Are people seeing? Am I showing up correctly? And so on.
If you're doing it out of ego.
Good. So in other words, the ego interferes with the prayer, right? We're talking to God, which is really what all of us said, right? It shows up in many different ways. It shows up with our insecurities. It shows up with our self-judgment. It shows up with our doubt in our faith. It shows up with what else is on my schedule today? Do I have time for this? So all of that is actually what prayer is designed for. It's designed to navigate that. It's not intended for us to show up and be perfectly aligned and talk to God in this pure blissful state. Prayer is actually a time where we engage in the struggle of what is holding me back from being fully present with God. The first section of the prayer is called Psuke de Zimra, which means the verses, literally translates as the verses of song. But Zimra, the word Zimra comes from the word to prune, lezamer eitzim, to prune trees. What's the process of pruning a tree? So you have to look which branch or which twig or which offshoot is not good. Which one needs to be discarded? Which one is still good? Which one needs to be moved around and so on, right? So the first part of prayer is this process where we're trying to bring God into our consciousness. And then we're looking at what are we bumping up against? My shortcomings. Okay, so how am I going to correct my shortcomings? But at the same time, realizing that God loves me and embraces me, even with my shortcomings, and that wants to hear from me, right? So the point is that the whole purpose of prayer is actually this time where we do this work. And when we do this inner work during prayer, then when we finish with prayer and we show up in the world, we're different people. Then when we're dealing with getting into the material world, as we've been talking, and finding the sparks there and elevating them, we're showing up differently. We're present. Oh, wait. I remember when I prayed, I talked about the fact that God is present in the physical reality, even though I had a little bit of a struggle with that, and I thought about it and I worked that through. Okay, now I'm here. Now I'm doing the work. Now I'm going to say a blessing on this cup and drink the coffee with intention to serve God. Beautiful. So all of the battle that takes place throughout the day, the battle of which we said is the result of the sin of Adam and Eve, that now we have to engage in the physical reality, that battle takes place during prayer. We are empowered from prayer, and the work that we do becomes elevated through prayer. So this is the meaning of this passage in the Zohar, that Shas Sleisa Shas Kirva, the time of prayer is a time of battle. This makes sense?
Should that be taken as exclusively? Our battle is in our prayer, but not in the rest of the day? I wouldn't think so.
No, they're both. But it's kind of like saying that the empowerment to be successful at the battle during the day stems from effective prayer. When we pray effectively, then we are empowered, we are charged, we're anchored. It doesn't mean that when you sit down to eat the steak, your animal soul doesn't kick in and say, wow, that's a good steak, I'm going to really enjoy this. But you immediately call back on your prayer and you say, okay, yes, dear animal, I know you like the steak, I know you like food, but let's remember what we spoke about. We had this conversation, we talked with God, and we had this conversation about living higher. So you can enjoy the steak, but we're going to enjoy it, and we're going to have a moment of intention that we're going to, or mindfulness, as I spoke yesterday, we're going to have a moment of mindfulness that the purpose of eating the steak is in order for us to elevate the steak, to serve God. Okay, that becomes a transformative experience. By the way, we mentioned the idea of a spiritual practice, right? When you fall out of a spiritual practice, when you don't pray, you don't do spiritual stuff, then when it comes to eating the steak, there's no voice that tells you, whoa, slow down, Charlie, right? You come into the room, you smell the steak, you're right there. I mean, the steak is a classic example, but we can use another common example. Your wife, your mother, your sister, your daughter, your son calls you up and they say something that sets you off. There's no voice that's saying, whoa, slow down. You don't have to react so strongly. Maybe there's a purpose here. What is the purpose? Let's think about it. Have you been working on yourself? When you have prayer, you're in a spiritual practice, so you have a momentary pause that says, whoa, what's going on over here? Right? It's not about me. This person's showing up, they're hurting, something's bothering them. Let me at least keep my mouth shut. It's a starting point. Then I can reflect on who they are and what they're struggling with, and then maybe I can be helpful to them. Maybe being helpful to them is by not saying anything. Maybe being helpful to them. But what happens is we get sucked into that vortex because the animal soul is the dominant consciousness. And as soon as we get triggered, everything explodes. So that's the battle. But if we want to resolve that battle, it starts with prayer. In prayer, we're addressing the two parts of who we are. Because in order to talk to God, you got to work through the animal soul. Because who's talking to God? It's your animal soul. It's your body. It's your mouth. It's your brain. It's your heart. And it's not easy because we don't see God in front of us. So we got to work through that process. And if we're working through that process, we're changing the frequency to a higher spiritual frequency, which automatically helps us during the rest of the day be a little bit more in tune. Very real. But by the way, it's hard to daven. It's hard to pray. I mean, to really be present. It's hard work. Now, as a result of the sin, Adam and Eve need to go to the place of the klippah, where the godly light is concealed. And there, in that place, he'll refine them, which is the meaning behind the words in the Torah that regarding Adam being sent to the land from which his body derived. In other words, now, because of the sin, Adam's body took on the properties of a physically conscious body. He had a physical body before the sin, but his relationship to his body was a spiritual one. In other words, he saw the godly in everything. The tzaddik sees the godly in everything. And that's the distinction. When you see the godly in everything, there is no struggle. If we were able to see, in the food that we eat, in the challenges that we encounter, that's one of my favorite challenges is the story of Bernie Marcus, right? Who recently passed away, who worked for this company, Handy Dan. I think it was called Handy Dan, and the CEO didn't like him, the chairman didn't like him, and they fought and this and that, and eventually they ousted him. He was a bully, and they ousted him from the company. And his friend Ken Langone, called him up then, and he said, "You've been given a golden horseshoe kick in the behind." And you should read his book; it's very powerful. Anyway, he experienced this really, what we say in Yiddish, a clap. He got whacked. He was doing good, and the bully bullied him till he got kicked out of the company. And he was angry, and he was upset, and he was resentful, and he wanted to sue this guy, and he had all this stuff. But he ultimately said, "You know what?" He took the advice of those around him. He said, "I'm going to do a different game plan here," and he chose to build Home Depot. He had this dream about Home Depot, and he chose to build Home Depot. Right? Now, what's the result of Home Depot? Besides the fact that he made personally billions of dollars, he used his money to do so much good for the world. The Jewish world, the secular world, the medical world. He just left billions of dollars that all have to be given away to charity over the next 20 years. So all the good that he did was $2 billion over 30 years. He's left many more than $2 billion that needs to be distributed over the next 20 years. I mean, just think about it. So take a moment in time. You have this bully who bullies you out of a company. And as a result of that, the world's going to be a better place. But in that moment, you don't know that because you don't see the story. If you could read the book, you walk out of there and say, "Thank you so much. I've been waiting for this moment." But you don't get to read the story. So you have to believe in God, and you have to struggle through that. If you're a tzaddik, you see this. If you're a tzaddik, you don't have to actually see the story. Your faith is so great that you know that God is in the story. And we can work towards having moments of that experience. I don't know that we can, if we're not a tzaddik, we can create such a transformation that we don't get any heart palpitations when something goes wrong. We get the heart palpitations, but we could work on more quickly moving into a place of faith and trust that there's part of a master plan. Adam, had he not sinned, would have been in that spiritual state. It would have seen the godly in everything. Because he sinned, so the spiritual consciousness was tweaked, the frequency went down, and now he sees the physical reality. So therefore, God says, now you got to go down to the place where you came from, meaning the physical consciousness part of the physical. Not just the physical, but the physical consciousness. And you got to deal with it on the most physical of levels. All right. We'll stop here. We'll take questions if there are any. And next week, we'll finish the discourse, God willing, and start something fresh after the new year. How long have we been? This is today was the 7th class, I think, on this discourse. I think so. All right. Yes. Yeah, please.
I guess I'm just curious, like, how do you gauge how effective your prayers become? Like, is it when you notice, like, when your daytime battle is becoming easier to pause, or when you're like, is it when you start to notice a consistent voice? Like, I guess I'm curious, like,
Yeah. So
maybe for you.
yeah, I'm not the master of prayer, but I can, yeah, but so I think the way, I think you actually answered it. So there are different elements to prayer. Let's expand that for a second. Prayer is not just about this inner refinement. In the Chabad spiritual service, that's the highest objective, but it's also an opportunity for us to ask God for our needs. It's a time for just connection with God, right? Without an agenda. In every relationship, you need to spend time in the relationship, and prayer is a time where we spend time with God, because life is busy, right? So we don't spend that much time with God. Of course, God is always present, but we don't spend time in a conscious union or communion with God, so prayer affords us that. But in terms of, so to speak, getting out of prayer what we need from prayer, yes, it's how we are discerning. I've mentioned this a few times. There's this approach of therapy called IFS, internal family systems. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but the idea is to recognize that inside each person, inside of me, I say multiple personalities. Inside of me, there are multiple parts, right? There's a family that lives inside of here. And I mentioned the movie, what's it called? Come on.
Who's in it?
It's an animated movie. They have 2 parts. The second part just came out. Inside Out, yes. So that's an IFS, essentially an IFS movie. But there's this guy anger that lives inside of me. There's this guy impatience. There's this guy pride. There's the little kid inside of me. There's all these different parts inside of me. So why am I going here? Oh, so during the day, there are different parts that show up. The challenges we experience is because we're not paying attention to the parts. We're defining the self by the part. So both in positive and negative, right? So somebody says something that bothers us, and we say, wow, you really, like, you cut to my essence. No, they didn't. They touched a part of you that needs some healing, that's hurting, that might be right or whatever. It's not the point. It's like, no, they didn't, this wasn't about you. This wasn't about me. This was a part of me that got triggered, right? The problem is that when I get triggered in the IFS language, there's a protector that comes out to protect that part. So the protector comes out and says, oh, you son of a gun, how dare you say that to me, right? So in IFS, the objective is to create discernment. The first thing is to recognize what's going on. That's the first step. The first step is, whoa, okay, yeah, that hit, that stung, but I'm okay. There's a part of me that got stung. Let me pay attention to that part. What do you need from me? How do you want to deal with the situation, right? What's missing in your world that you need to? Sometimes it's a younger part that just needs some comfort and reassurance that the world is still on its axis and everything's going to be okay. The more work you do, the more you have discernment. So the first objective of this inner battle that takes place during prayer is to create discernment. Very, very specific, but very general, which is, what's at play here? Is it my animal soul? Or is it my godly soul? Right? The food that's in front of me, the temptation that's in front of me, the trigger that just triggered, the desires that I have, the goals that I'm setting, whatever it is that is being experienced intellectually, emotionally, physically, the first result of prayer is that I'm asking the question, what's going on inside of me? And by the way, you can pray every single day, and you're going to have a good run on prayer, where the result of that is going to be more refined and ability to discern, and then it's going to trickle off. Either you won't pray for a while, or your prayer won't be that profound. And when that happens, it'll show up, because you're not going to be as discerning. And you won't necessarily realize it right away that you're not so discerning until you got really frustrated and you say, oh, you know what? I got to get back to prayer. It's like physically, right? I've been accused of being a yo-yo dieter, right? So, I eat and I enjoy the food. And then at some point I say, oh my gosh, like, I'm working on the weight and it's not so good. And maybe I got to go. What happened? At a certain point, I'm starting to feel it. So when I start feeling it, I go back to trying to eat healthy and not eating all the junk, right? And then eventually I get to a better place, and then I forget about it and it starts catching up again. This is the process of life, right? So prayer, if you don't have to be a yo-yo dieter. You can pray every single day and you can invest yourself. But I think the nature of the human being is that we live in that teeter-totter of the animal soul and the godly soul. But hopefully the moments between the animal dominance and the godly soul dominance, the teeter-tottering, the time in between becomes diminished. Like, we can stay on track more frequently than not. All right. Huh? Thank you. All right, everybody have a great week.